Hello and welcome to the Church Society podcast. I'm Ros Clarke. I'm the Associate Director of Church Society and I'm your host here on these podcasts. Make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast. You can subscribe on YouTube by clicking the button and the notification bell. You can subscribe if you're an audio listener on your regular podcast provider. And you may even be able to rate and review the Church Society podcast. So if you've not yet done that and you're a regular listener, we'd love it if you could say what you think about it. This week on the podcast, I am joined by Jake Eggertsen and Chris Moore. Jake, why don't we start with you? Tell us whereabouts in the country you are, tell us what you do, tell us who you have been locked down with.
Thanks, Ros. Lovely to be with you. I'm Jake Eggertsen, curate at St Paul's in Banbury, along the M40, kind of in the middle of the country, and I've been locked down with my family, Nicola, 3 children, 3 young girls. And
have you been in the spectre of homeschooling?
Indeed, we have. Which has come with challenges and joys.
Great. And Chris, tell us about you. Whereabouts are you and who have you been locked down with and what do you do?
Hi Ros, I'm rector of a group of 4 parishes which are in Herefordshire, so that's on the Welsh border towards the bottom. And I'm rector of those parishes. I have been locked down with all my sons. I've got 5 sons, and one of whom, the youngest, was doing his A-levels when all this began, and the others who are in sort of various forms of other bits and bobs. And one of my eldest son also brought with him a girlfriend in tow, so she's been staying like the lady in the van on our driveway in a caravan. So it's been busy, and yes,
that's when you're suddenly very thankful for enormous rectories. Do you have an enormous rectory?
I have an enormous 5-bedroom detached rectory and half an acre of gardens with a cherry orchard at the end and a stream running through it.
Oh, my word.
Walk out of my front door and I can walk down to the River Wye or walk up the hills, and it is Eden.
Living the dream, absolutely. So a full house, but not quite the same spectre of young children being homeschooled, taking your full attention all the time. Good. Chris, back in April, when we were sort of near the beginning of all of this life that we have been suddenly becoming accustomed to, you wrote a little bit for us on the Church Society blog about what you were doing in your benefice and how that was working. You were doing, I think you were just starting to get going with some video services, but also doing emails and even, I think, letters to people in your parishes. How has your ministry developed over the last few months? Is that the sort of pattern that you stuck with? Did you try new things?
No, that was basically it. The first thing I did was to, very early on, start a daily devotional email that goes out. It's not long, probably sort of 3-4 paragraphs. And that's carried on all the way through. In fact, the app I use to write in tells me I've written 60,000 words of these emails going through. So normally speaking, during the week, there's a sort of pattern. It's always Church History Tuesday. It's always Hymn Story Friday. And then on the Sunday, I do a longer email, which is it takes about 5 minutes to read. And that's a kind of sermon on one of the passages for the given Sunday. And once a week, I then print those off and I put them in envelopes and post those to the people who aren't
on email.
So that's meant that I've got 100 email addresses who get that every day, and then a further 20 envelopes who get that once a week. So it's got a high proportion and not on email. Then we started doing video services, which it kills me really, because I'm not very good at being on camera. We can do responses, we can sing hymns in the services because our bubble is large, and all my children are well drilled and will sing when we ask them to sing. And we've alternated that between prayer book and the common worship service, because half my parish is a prayer book, half of them are common worship, and they go up onto YouTube, and we get about sort of 50 or so views a week. So again, it's not big numbers, but I know that people do watch them, and that's something. And that's really been the pattern. And then it's the usual background stuff of phone calls, no into funerals. I've done a lot of funerals. I've done almost a year's worth of funerals over this period. So that takes a bit of organising. But apart from that, that's been your main. We've stuck to the model. Yes.
I have to say, I am really impressed, because when we did that back in April, I think I watched one or two or some of your kind of early video stuff.
Right.
And the new stuff that's on the website, that when I was just sort of checking last week, I'm so impressed with how you have the sort of liturgy and the video. You know, it feels like there's been some technological upskilling that may have happened.
That's my eldest son. He is technologically upskilled. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, that's another advantage, isn't it, of having large family at home, is you've got built-in congregation and tech support.
And
Jake,
we have our own web server, which helps.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Jake, just tell us a little bit about your church in Banbury, what it's like normally and what it's been like over these last few months.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm going to check out Chris's website straight after this. Sounds brilliant.
We'll put a link in the program notes.
Banbury is a bit of an urban centre, really, surrounded by lovely Oxfordshire countryside. So it's a mixed area socio-economically, and our church very much reflects that. Our parish contains a big estate called Breach Hill, and where Gordon Ramsay grew up, actually. And so yeah, we have 2 services normally on a Sunday morning, and then evening in Breach Hill itself, 2 different sites. And but since lockdown, we've gone to 1 live Zoom service on a Sunday morning, which again has massive pros and cons. It's enabled us to stay connected in a way that I don't think people were expecting, and has been a blessing to many. But it's also meant that we have, the technologically challenged struggled to get along. So we tried to do other things for them, posting DVDs or letters and things through doors, and ringing round and that sort of thing. But it's been a challenge. It's and it's interesting.
So you have chosen to do that through Zoom, and so has that meant that have you had any people who are not normally part of your church family being able to join that, or has that felt quite sort of focused just on the church family that you already had?
It's mostly focused on the church family we had, and we felt it was responsible of us to sort of look after them in the community, especially those who are vulnerable. But yeah, surprisingly, we have welcomed some visitors, and people have seen on our website that we're holding live services and have asked to join. It's not easy for them, because they have to get in touch and ask for security, and there are safeguarding issues surrounding that. So we've had to work really hard at just being careful and wise and about that. But praise the Lord, some have joined us, which is lovely.
Great. That is great. I mean, it's one of those things that churches, I think, have all been trying to balance, is that sort of how you do that appropriately for your church family, but also wanting to be open, and different ways have different pros and cons. Just both of you, as you now look back over the sort of 4 months or so that it is, because it does feel like we're beginning to move into a new phase, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But as you look back over the last 4 months, what have been the encouragements, and what have been perhaps the disappointments that you've seen in terms of what God's been doing in your churches? I don't know who wants to kick off with that. Chris, we had you first last time, so let's go back to you again.
Okay, thanks. I think the encouragement has been that people have responded well to the emails that have gone out. What I was really hopeful was it was a way of keeping connection between the church and the people, or people themselves, during. And I know we'll talk a little bit about how we might be coming out of lockdown in a moment, but it's certainly been the case that I think we've brought some of the fruits of that has been seen in the numbers who've come back out to church again over the last couple of Sundays. And it's also been a good opportunity to get people thinking more about their faith during the week. And I can be more, I said, blunt in what I'm putting out by email as well, and perhaps challenging some areas and talking about where God is in the suffering and this kind of stuff. So that's been an encouragement. And I think as well, it's really forced us to engage more with the website and online, which I've always sort of shied away from, really. I don't do social media. I'm a very typically antisocial Anglican rural vicar who just likes being left alone. So it's helped me overcome some of that. But also, I think it's demonstrated to me how poor our offer has been to our housebound people, of which, of course, in Asian congregations, there's only going to be more of. So it's really said to me that as we come back out of this lockdown, we've got to keep our game high for those who are at home, those who can't come out for whatever reason. And also the fact that not every one of my parish churches has a service every Sunday. And so, people having a fortnightly pattern of worship, really I should have been doing more for them in the intervening Sunday. So we will change what we do when we come out, but it has been an encouraging thing.
That's really great, isn't it? And that's certainly been one of my prayers all the way through. And I feel like I say this every week on the podcast, that we aren't just aiming to go back to what we were doing in February, that we should be learning things that we will be wanting to do better as we go forward, even when all the restrictions are lifted, whenever that comes to be. And so that's really great that's opened up some of those things for you as well. Have there been things that have been a real sense of sadness or disappointment during that time as well, Chris?
I think the sadness has come, we've had 3 members of congregations die in this period, and the sadness has been that we can't have a funeral, or couldn't then have a funeral for them in church. So that's something which would have been very much part of what the church would have done. It's a very tight-knit rural community, so we would have expected large services. And I think the sadness has been as well for those who really have been very isolated during this period. Some people are used to it. Farmers are used to that kind of isolation. They just get on with it. But others haven't been used to that. And I think, and that sense of just not knowing if people and who's getting overlooked in this, I think that's been the real issues.
I think the funerals is a big thing, isn't it? For a lot of people, I think that sort of public expression of coming together to grieve and shared experience in that, I think there will be quite a lot of perhaps sort of long-term having to process that in different ways for people. This was years ago now, but when my grandfather died, I was living in America, and for various reasons it didn't seem the right thing to come back for the funeral. But it sort of 6 to 12 months later that I realized that I hadn't really dealt with the sort of grief of losing him, because I hadn't been together with other people in that process as normal. And I wonder if there will be some of that needing to come out as we go forward. Jake, what about for you? What have been the sort of great encouragements and also the disappointments and sadnesses, perhaps?
Yeah, for me, the two go hand in hand, really. And I can go and agree with all that Chris has said. It really resonates with our experience too. Paradoxically, it seems that some of the great encouragements have come out of what we've lost, in terms of what our kind of realization of what we had as we gather together each week physically, and the value of corporate worship and our togetherness. So that's been a great encouragement that people are longing to get back together, really. And at the same time, the discouragement comes when our fellowship is basically mediated through a screen, and I have to preach into a little green dot every week or whenever I preach. And that's just really hard and quite sad, to be honest. And again, with Chris, that's all that said, it has also woken us up to some of the issues faced by housebound members of the church and those restricted by physical disabilities and so on. And it's been a joy and privilege to care for them during this time as a church, but also we long to do that better going forward.
Absolutely. We talked last week on the podcast about a little bit about how having all our social interactions more or less mediated online has shaped some of our relationships and the way that we engage. So I'll put a little link, certainly if you're on YouTube, I'll put a little link there to last week's episode. If you've not watched that, you might want to check that out. Chris, you mentioned that your church has begun to start, or at least one of your churches, I don't know quite how this works, but you can tell us, start using the buildings again and getting back together. Just tell us what that's looking like at the moment. Are you back to a sort of a normal pattern of Sunday services, or a restricted pattern, or what have you been doing?
We're back to a normal-ish pattern. So all of the churches are ready to go. The way that the benefice population is 2,200, so it's not enormous. Of that 2,200, 1,000 live in Foundhope, which is the village where I live in. It's where the rector is. So that church is being open now every Sunday. And then I'm opening Woolhope, which is my next largest building, every Sunday as well. And then the 3 smaller churches we're doing once a month. We're going to try this for July and August just to see how that goes. But we're back to fairly normal services from that point of view. And we also do our midweek communion service now as well.
And have you found that most people that you would have expected to see have been coming to building? Are there people still shielding and vulnerable and sort of unwilling to come back? Have you had new people join you? How has that gone?
We've had I would say, I'm just trying to think now, I would say probably about 3/4 or sort of 60, about 2/3, 3/4 have actually come back into the building for the services. I mean, Foundhope itself, our regular congregation on a Sunday would be sort of 40 to 45, and we've been having 30 come there. And that works because in rural areas where we've got these enormous old buildings, we've been socially distancing for years. So we can fit the people in quite easily, and that works.
I've been very jealous of people with those sort of small congregations in large buildings lately, because my church, we've got a huge congregation in a tiny building that we never fit in normally, so it's going to take us for a while to get back to that. So that's good that people there. And in terms of the services, do they look quite similar to what you were able to do before? Obviously we're not able to have congregational singing in the same sort of way. Have you had to make other alterations to what you actually do when you get together?
The services have all, the liturgy has been the same. Say 2 congregations of prayer book, so we do that, and that's it is what it is. And the common worship service we do is quite liturgical. Looks quite prayer book like anyway, and so we've used those. We've had the organist at all the services before and after. They've played sort of medleys of hymns that people would know, and we've also had a hymn played at a point during the service, and encouraged people to sort of read through. Some have muttered along, some have hummed. I've got one rebellious chap who sings lustily, but we're trying to sort him out. But basically that's how we've tried to do it. I don't want to put too many hymns in because it gets awkward, but equally people have liked that opportunity just to have, because often the hymns are a time to daydream, they're a time to stand up and stretch, and they're time to sort of do other things as well. So I'll try to keep that in.
Yeah, interesting. Jake, have you been able to get back into your buildings yet or not?
No, to be honest, we're not quite in the same place as Chris. When we went into lockdown, I think we were running on adrenaline really, and our life was marked by a lot of activity and trying to get up and running and so on. So quite honestly, we're struggling for energy and wisdom in this. Bearing in mind the constraints of our building, so we're not able to fit everyone in at the same time, socially distanced. So we've got some chats coming up. PCC are meeting in the week, tonight actually, to talk about it, and our aim is to move towards getting back somewhere soon. But there's a lot of uncertainty and expectations are mixed, so we're finding our way more slowly, I think.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And the sort of, it's not just the kind of, could we physically do it, but have we got the capacity to do the cleaning or sort out the, tracking who's there, and, all the sort of logistics around it are still pretty daunting. And if you're particularly, even in Chris, you're saying in your situation, maybe 2/3 to 3/4 are able to be back in church, you still want to be providing for those who can't. And if you're in the sort of situation where it's going to be a much smaller proportion who are able to be in the building, you absolutely still need to be providing for those who can't. And so it's not kind of switching to a different method, it's adding in a whole lot more, isn't it? Potentially, it's saying we're still going to keep having to do the online stuff and also do in-person stuff, and that's a big ask, I think. I went to a wedding on Saturday, which was exciting. So we had a couple, she's part of our church family, and they got married on Saturday, and the service was live streamed, and it didn't go brilliantly because the internet in the church building is not as great as it could be, but it was lovely. But it was really interesting to kind of watch how they'd done it. And one thing they done was they did have hymns, and people stood up. And I think you're exactly right, Chris, that the hymns provide a sort of moment in the service, don't they, which feels different. So everybody stood up, and they just had one soloist standing sort of right up at the front of the church near the table, sort of, at least 20 feet away from the next nearest person. And she sang beautifully. And I think that, again, also just helped people, whether they were doing that sort of mentally running through the hymn themselves or whatever, even if they were sort of humming along, to feel like they had that. So there are different ways of doing it, but it isn't going to be straightforward, and it doesn't feel like what we're used to, perhaps. One of the things I do really want to commend to people in this is Andrew Cinnamon wrote a blog post for us on the Church Society website last week about, because one of the things that hymns do is give people in the congregation a chance to participate. You're saying it. And Chris, you mentioned that you sort of have quite liturgical services anyway, but not everybody has been in churches where that's been the normal habit. And I really want to encourage people to say, well, actually, this is a great moment to say, even if it's not been our tradition, we should be doing more of that spoken liturgy that does give people in the congregation a chance to participate and stand up and say what they believe, even if they can't sing it. So that might be a thing that could come out of this a bit more. Yeah,
I'd hope so. I mean, if we just consider the benefits of recovering that theological and liturgical heritage as a culture within Anglican evangelicalism, that would be wonderful. The reality is services weren't casually thrown together in the past. They weren't just driven by what works. They were carefully crafted. They fostered love and worship of the triune God. They're in the shape of the gospel. They contain, key tenets of the faith that are passed down from generation to generation: commandments, the Lord's Prayer, creed. There's a givenness to them that I think perhaps we've lost, but it does require sort of confidence and time in that. And maybe this enforced period of spoken practice will benefit us in the long run.
And one of the things people often say, if they're not quite so convinced of the value of liturgy, is the sort of repetition. But actually, I think, again, this period of time has shown us how valuable something that is familiar can be, and the comfort that you get from saying the same thing that you've always said and knowing that it's as true as it has always been. So I hope that will be something that maybe, again, isn't something that's just for now, but actually maybe has a longer term benefit in many churches. I wonder, and it may be too early to begin to say this, but maybe you have thoughts on this already, whether we can sort of assess what have been some of the spiritual effects of this period of being apart physically from our churches, for our churches and the congregations, but also particularly the sort of effects that this is having on people who are pastors, who are ministers, and the sort of emotional burden. It's been an exhausting time, I think, for many people, but it's also been a completely unexpected way of having to do ministry or try to do ministry. And I don't know whether either of you have thoughts on sort of how you may be feeling, how you think maybe colleagues or contemporaries or peers may be feeling, and how we can sort of speak some of those things that maybe people are afraid to admit publicly. Jake, you have thoughts on this? I know we've talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, I do really. I think it really does depend on how you see what this time is. And for some, lots has been said about how the Lord might be using this in terms of mission opportunities in the church, and praise God if that's the case. That's wonderful. But lockdown has also been a deeply humbling experience, and I don't think there's any need to be triumphalist about it. I personally have seen it more as a time of spiritual exile or displacement from our place and setting of rest. And so generally speaking, I think the missing note in the Anglican evangelical church, at least, is sorrow and lament. Not just because of our physical circumstances, but spiritually speaking, in the Lord's providential care of us, how might this time be a means of the Lord's discipline? How should we treat it? Should we treat it as a period of frenetic activity, or should we be using it to examine ourselves, our attitudes, our assumptions, our practices? It's certainly exposed fragility and mortality and led to deep and meaningful conversations about things like death, prayer, fasting. But yeah, I've been really struck by how the church in times past hasn't reacted with activism, but in periods like this, it's been more marked by patience and prayer.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think there has been the sort of prevailing trend that I've seen has been, we must put a brave face on this. We must make the most of these opportunities. We must see this as, new things opening up, and much less of that, what has been shutting down and what have been the struggles with that. I don't know, Chris, whether you have thoughts on that.
I used, before we went into lockdown, but as this was all starting off, I used to use the prayer book Collect in times of plague and common sickness in the services, which is a very penitential collect, and it talks about the plagues visited on Israel in the past and our need for repentance. And so I have felt that this period really could have been, or maybe should have been, a period of repentance for individuals in the church ourselves, but also church corporate as the things that we've done. It's very easy to point the finger elsewhere, but and when the first sermon I preached 8 days ago or whatever, when I came back, is I in good sort of evangelical fashion, I suppose, I changed the gospel reading, but preached on the Tower of Siloam. Whose fault is it? Well, we don't know, but repent, otherwise it might happen to you. And was really trying to say there, what do we need to repent of in that? I think it has been, it's been a period which is, and you said this, Jake, but it's been a period which has really exposed the weaknesses that we've had in our model of church or in our assumptions about church. And it has stripped us back to our core and made us ask the question, what is important about, what is ministry in all of this? I chair governing bodies of 2 church schools. That's taken an awful lot of time because, of course, obviously with children coming back and all the rest of that. Is that core to my ministry? Is it not? And what is my role in that as a Christian minister in that situation, not just a chair of governors? So I think it's been a time, I've certainly found it a time of reflecting on what is ministry, which I hope will carry on as you go through.
I think, it strikes me there are at least 2 things that as evangelicals in the UK we have not valued highly, that the Lord has just stripped away from us. So the sacraments, and I think there's been a lot of conversation about that, and it's been very striking how that has been such a focus of conversation. And I'm not sure, I think some of that's come out of a right hunger for the sacrament, and some of it seems to me to be prompted more by a how dare those bishops tell us what to do attitude, which may not be quite as godly. But the other thing that we have, I think, undervalued as Christians, as evangelicals in the UK, is our places. And that thing of our churches are just glorified rain shelters.
Yes.
Well, yes, but also that they are places that are full of history, and there's something about going to the same place each week to do the same things that God uses, and that's why he gives people in the Old Testament land that is theirs in perpetuity through the generations, so that it bears witness to how God has been faithful to your family through the generations. And actually it turns out not being able to be in our church buildings is quite a hard and difficult thing.
I quite agree. I think there's a lot of sort of hidden Gnosticism in our communities, and more serious theological reflection needs to be done on physicality of corporate worship. And it's easy to say the church is not the building, it's the people, but scripturally speaking, the embodied assembly of God's people is an essential, not incidental part of church worship. And it anticipates the resurrection reality as well of our physical incorporation into Christ. So I quite agree.
Yeah, I think that's
yeah.
I think that's right. You know, and we know this, don't we? We know that listening to a sermon online is not the same as being in the room with the person preaching it to us, looking us in the eye as he does so. But yeah, maybe there's something there in what is it that we need to learn? Well, what is it that God stripped away from us during this time? That we need to learn about that. And I wonder as well, as we just think about how this feels for, you know, both of you talked about sort of reevaluating what ministry is and what's important. I think as we sort of go beyond this sort of initial crisis time, there is going to be potentially quite a big fallout for ministers. I think people may already be feeling some of these things, but sort of just pushing it down and getting on with it week by week. But I think there will be people feeling guilty that they weren't able to do more. There'll be people worrying that actually theirs will be the only church that has declined during lockdown. There will be people afraid, particularly because of all the news about redundancies and clergy cuts and that sort of thing. And I wonder what should we be doing in sort of anticipation that this may be a really difficult 6 to 12 months or even longer potentially for people in ministry, and how can we help people be resilient through that really difficult time?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've experienced with others in my patch that those who haven't reopened, I mean, we reopened straight away, but it was easy for us to do that.
Yeah.
But where others haven't, and the city churches, which are fuller, have found it more difficult to do. I'm just fortunate my congregation is spread across many buildings, but there is a great sense of guilt there. And I think there is an angst there that they will be viewed as being lazy or whatever else there is. There is a lot of financial problems which are being exposed by this. I mean, even in my little patch, one of my churches, Brockhampton, beautiful arts and craft churches. We've got Burns-Jones tapestries, we've got William Morris carvings, and we would have lost throughout this year about £9,000 worth of income from tourism, and that will really. But we've got reserves, so it's not the end of the world. And they're there for a rainy day and it's raining. So in a sense, that's fine. But other churches, it's really exposed their financial weaknesses. And in our diocese, a high proportion of our congregations are in single figures. And some of them, I just can't see how they will survive. So what do we do? Well, I think in the end, the view I've taken maybe is that if I'm sure of what my calling is as a minister of the gospel, if I feel I'm being faithful in the way that I've done that, then I've done what I can and I will leave the rest to God, which sounds very pious, I know, but it's the kind of where I've ended up. And I think there will be people, and many people have been on enforced sabbaticals really, and everybody, when they go on sabbatical, the first thing they do when they come back is hand their notice in and go to another church. So there'll be plenty of that, I'm sure, around. It's a busy time for the board of patronages and all the rest of it. I think there is a problem of guilt, and I think it has to be said as well that I'm fortunate in being in a rural area. My combined congregation is 120, but it's split over many buildings. We are liturgical. We are used to said liturgy. I don't have any admin staff. It's only me here. There's no other ministry. It's just me. So it means, though, that it's been easy for me to carry on through this period. But I think for the churches, and maybe this is where you are, the churches which have got staff, where the things are busier, where you've got music groups, where you're more technologically driven, that's been a harder thing for people to carry on doing, and we need to acknowledge that. But for good old-fashioned rural ministry, this has been straightforward.
Yes, and I think that's a really interesting observation there, Chris, that actually it's sort of in some ways has inverted how we normally see things. Often we would see those bigger churches, the larger staff teams, you know, the full congregations as the places where it's easy to do ministry, where there's lots going on, where God is doing much. And actually, you're right, those are the places that have had it in some way hardest. Things have been turned upside down for them much more than in some of the places we might have tended to look at and think, well, you know, what's going on there. And the other thing that you said, and I think this is the thing I want to keep saying loudly as possible, it is the Lord who builds his church. And so we must keep trusting that and not feel that if things have failed, if things have declined, if people have not returned who we thought should have returned to our churches, if we're worried about money, if we're worried about redundancies, well, okay, but it is the Lord who builds his church. Yeah.
This isn't an answer to all of those very real practical needs and difficulties, but seeing our ministries as participating in Christ's ministry as well, just as our identity is found in him, will give us safer ground than seeing those things as detached. I can't recommend highly enough a book I've read this year, if this is okay to do.
Yeah, we can move into the time of recommendations.
Oh, right, okay. Well, it was recommended to me by some friends, Alden and Ben, but it's Living in Union with Christ by Grant McCaskill.
Okay.
And it's a beautiful, hope-filled book about how our union with Christ affects our ministry lives, and helps us to see everything in relation to him, everything constituted by him. It really diagnoses and kind of dissects our culture's perhaps sort of hidden legalism in terms of seeing things as a means to an end, or our ministries as commodities to gain control in some way or whatever. But it's not meant to be a destruction of the way we operate, but it really is a hope-filled, beautiful help to us as Christian ministers. So I'd highly commend that as something to perhaps do that reflection.
Yeah, and again, if that's the thing that comes out of this, is people doing much more of that reflection on where is their hope, where is their identity, where is their sense of success, and so on. I'm finding that in the Lord rather than in external things. That would be a wonderful thing. Well, again, no doubt these are conversations we will continue to keep having, but it does feel as though we sort of turned a corner in the last couple of weeks into a slightly different phase. So interesting to hear sort of reflections on how that's going and the implications of that. But let's share. Jake, have you got anything else that you wanted to recommend to us other than big tome on theology?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Let's see. You recommended the Andrew Cinnamon article called Loving the Liturgy, which is on the Church Society blog. The other thing I was going to point out is, if you're a junior Anglican evangelical, we've got a conference called Jake.
Named after Jake.
Yeah, not quite. But Mark Smith is doing two sessions, one sort of more seminarish and another one. But he's doing a session on leading a service, which would really tie into some of the discussions we've had, I think. And he's also doing a session on rich liturgy, which I'm really looking forward to attending. So if you're in that category of people, perhaps sign up and do that. And the last one was just in terms of what we talked about in terms of worship and everything else. The Jonathan Gibson and Mark Ernge, sorry, Mark.
Maybe.
Edited book, Reformation Worship, which just gets into the deep things of our theological heritage.
Brilliant. Thank you for doing my advert for me. If you are a lay person, whether or not you do work for the church or you just go to a church, if you are an ordinand in training, if you are a curate, or if you're in your first couple of years of being an incumbent, then you are eligible to come to Jake. And this year it's all online and it's all free. There is details on the Church Society website, and I'll put a link in the programme notes for this as well. We would love to have you join us. And Mark Smith's sessions, planning service and rich liturgy, I'm sure will be excellent. Chris, do you have anything that you've been enjoying that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I got carried away. I've got loads.
Brilliant.
This book I read last year, All Things Back to Front, All Things for Good, by Thomas Watson, who a 17th century Puritan. This is produced by the Banner of Truth, but you can get it as an ebook for free at various places as well.
Brilliant.
I read it last year and I used bits of it in these daily emails, because suddenly the great kind of crushing, I've got to think of something else, comes through. And whenever I would use some of that or put a quote in from there, people responded very positively to it. And it's simply saying, if God works for good in all things for those who love him, well, then God is using the pandemic for good, and where do we find the goodness of God in COVID, say? So it doesn't shy away from that. It doesn't shy away that God is good even when things are going bad. So that one's certainly well worth a look. I've also got a bit of a bugbear. I think a lot of our theological debates in the good old ship, the Church of England, over in current situations, what they demonstrate to me is that we've lost a lot of what used to be understood as the classical understandings of God, that God is changeless, that God does not have passions, or, the 39 articles, God hath no parts. This is a very good book that None Greater by Matthew Barrett, that deals with these sorts of classical bits of our understanding of the nature of God. And I think they're foundational. And I think we'll find that a lot of our issues in the COV come down to the fact that we've forgotten some of these, and they're not taught very often in the seminaries. Two more. This book I read at the beginning of lockdown, just the best book I read on biblical theology, I would say, ever. It's Michael Morales, Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord, a biblical theology of the book of Leviticus. This will do you good. But it's an extraordinary book, just for tracing themes from Genesis through to Revelation. Just an extraordinarily good book. And then the final thing is a thing, not a book. During lockdown, I have finally encountered Sabbath, keeping Sabbath, the importance of keeping the Sabbath, the benefit of keeping it, that the Sabbath is a day given to the Lord, to the enjoyment of the Lord. And that, if I pray I can carry anything through from the lockdown into the rest of my life, it is proper Sabbath keeping.
Wonderful. Actually, I mentioned on the podcast a couple of months ago, I'd been reading The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer, and completely separately, a friend of mine messaged me last week saying, I've been reading what I think you'd really like. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. I'm like, okay. Anyway, we had a chat about it yesterday, and the thing that both of us had really taken from the book was the way that he speaks about Sabbath. And and it made me think again about how do I keep Sabbath and so on. But one of the things I loved about it, he talks about every week he and his family will say to each other, what's been the highlight of your week? And he says, it's really boring because every week I say the same, it's the Sabbath. And I thought, how do I make Sabbath to be the highlight of the week? Would be a great thing. Good. I just have one thing this week, and I feel slightly bad about recommending this because I'm still in the middle of it, but American Gospel, some people may well have seen this. It came out a couple of years ago. There's an hour-long version that's free on YouTube, but also if you've got Amazon Prime, it is on Amazon Prime, I think. I don't know. I feel like someone said it was on Netflix as well. I'm not sure. But anyway, the sort of longer version is available if you've got some kind of paid subscription, but the free version as well. And I think it would be quite easy to watch it and think, gosh, that American church is awful. They've got the gospel all wrong. But I am very struck watching it by how much of what is clearly problematical, the legalism and the moralism and the aspects of the prosperity gospel are things which are creeping in our churches as well and distorting, so that the gospel is not always a gospel at all. So yeah, really interesting film. I think the sort of full-length version is sort of 2.5 hours, but really well worth your time looking that out. Great. Thank you both so much for joining us this week. I just wanted to let people know that there won't be a podcast next week because I'm on holiday. And during August, I'm not sure, there won't be a podcast every week. There may be one or two, but we'll be back with our sort of normal regular schedule in September. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Don't forget, if you haven't already, subscribe, rate, review, leave us a comment, tell us what you're enjoying, and share the podcast with anyone you think might be interested. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ros.